All right, today we're going to talk about the principles behind fashioning a peace deal. This was all prompted by Trump's social media post to Putin to end the war. Trump, as you may recall, wrote, quote, "I'm going to do Russia, whose economy is failing, and President Putin a very big favor. Settle now and stop this ridiculous war. It's only going to get worse. If we don't make a deal soon, I have another choice, put high levels of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and various other participating countries. Let's get this war, which never would have started if I were president, over with. We can do it the easy way or the hard way, and the easy way is always better. It's time to make a deal." End quote. Okay, so as a sidelight, the Russian economy is hurting from a number of sources I've consulted, and sanctions do work. Sanctions are effective if they're targeted and if they're enforced. Okay, so the law of nations allows us to figure out how to fashion a peace deal, a peace agreement. Okay, so the law of nations does what? Let's do a recap. It deals with the relationships between states, so state to state relationships between states and non-state actors, and relationships sometimes between non-state actors and non-state actors. So it deals with those things. It grew up from a number of different sources. It grew up from an understanding of the natural law and the natural law itself. It grew up from custom. It grew up from treaties. It grew up from Christianity. The principles of Christianity and things in the Bible helped to form the law of nations. Now, the law of nations includes things like laws of the sea, laws of treaties, laws of international organizations, human rights law, laws of war. And the law of nations is under attack by Russia and China, who want to do away with it or amend it or change it to such a degree that they have inordinate power and injustice becomes the norm. The rule of force comes to be the way to resolve disputes instead of the rule of law. And the rule of law, international law, the law of nations, provides us with a means for a redress for the breach of international law. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it breached international law. It violated the provisions of Articles 2 and 51 of the United Nations Charter. The Charter is a treaty. So therefore, and Russia's a signatory to it, therefore when Russia violated that treaty, it committed not just an illegal act, but an immoral act. And so this is very serious. How do we go about bringing about peace? And like I said, there's a way to redress this breach of international law. Under the current state of the law of nations, there's two major categories or two major ways that have to be considered for the redress of the breach. But before I go to those, I want to go back to Epstein's work with dealing with the Catholic theologians and intellectuals. And he identified four factors in reaching a peace. These were reparations, sanctions, restitution, and security. Okay. So reparations are reimbursement of expenses and all damages. So like the cities you saw destroyed in the first frame of this video, that have to be rebuilt. That's an example. Okay. Sanctions punish as in vindictive justice. Okay. The leadership of Russia for causing this illegal war can be held personally responsible. They're being charged with other crimes under the Rome Statute, crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, cultural genocide, and more. So they can be prosecuted. Restitution. That is to restore the right which is lost, or to return the land or goods that had been unjustly taken. So the Russians have taken things out of Ukraine, Crimea, and the four provinces, and they've also seized this land illegally. So that means they would have to give back the land and return those things. And then security. Security is protect the country and the community of nations or the collectivity of states. In other words, it's a guarantee of peace. And this, I think, is a very important point because the war is, in my estimation, between Russia and the world, the collectivity of states, because Russia is challenging the international order by attacking the law of nations and by waging an illegal, immoral war and denying the sovereignty of Ukraine. And the sovereignty of Ukraine is guaranteed by the UN Charter and by international law, other international law. Okay. So when Zelensky talks about this idea of getting security guarantees and Russia recognizing its sovereignty, this goes to the issue of security. NATO membership goes to the issue of NATO membership for Ukraine goes to the issue of security, not just for Ukraine, but for the collectivity of states. Because once Ukraine gets attacked, then the world suffers, and the world has suffered as a result of this war. With a NATO membership or an alliance membership, that shows that Ukraine maintains its sovereignty, because that's part of sovereignty of a country, be able to make, arrangements for collective security to protect its country. With that kind of an arrangement, security guarantees, NATO membership, what you have then is a very great deterrence to Russia. Russia is not going to attack Ukraine then, because then it goes to war with NATO. And NATO is there to make sure, NATO would be there to make sure that Russia did not go back into Ukraine. Okay, so those are the four principles that Epstein and the Catholics laid out. And you'll find those in the two main principles of the law of nations, redress of breaches of agreements, that I'm going to talk about now. And those two principles are terminate the wrongful conduct and reparation. So terminate the wrongful conduct is stop the violation of international law. Okay, stop the war. Includes discontinue, revoking, cancellation of the act causing the violation, abstain from any further violation, stop the war, don't take any more territory, do what you're supposed to do, which is to withdraw from that territory, because again, the community of nations through the United Nations General Assembly has told Russia what they got to do. You got to get out. And then repeal any laws which illegally annex that foreign territory. By the way, it's a principle of international law that you cannot recognize property that has been annexed through the use of aggression or force or violence, and as in contravention of international law. So what do we see in that first point? Terminate the wrongful conduct. Well, you see an aspect of security, see an aspect of restitution. Again, concepts that came from Christianity and are now in the current law of nations, in the current international order, which the United States has helped to bring about and strengthen over the years. What's the second principle? Reparation, which is, as far as possible, quote, as far as possible, wipe out all the consequences of the illegal act and reestablish the situation which would, in all probability, have existed if that act had not been committed, end of quote. So then the Horn Book goes on and details restitution in kind, restore the status quo ante, pay compensation, punitive or exemplary damages. Well, what are we talking about there? Restitution in kind. You give back the land again. Still, it's the concept, of restitution. You give back the land, restore the status quo ante. Get out of Ukraine. You recognize the sovereignty of Ukraine. Pay compensation. So that would be reparations as understood by Epstein and company. And perhaps even punitive or exemplary damages. Those are sanctions as understood um, by Epstein and the Catholic scholars. So there you see these ideas from the Catholic law of nations in the current international law order, current law of nations order, which the United States has helped to implement around the world and protected around the world for at least 80 years. Also, what happens a lot of times is, according to practice of the states, there's an acknowledgement of the violation and an apology would be given. So the Russians would acknowledge they violated international law and apologize for what they did. We also know that there's the Rome Statute for prosecuting for war crimes, and Putin has been named a defendant there with other leaders of Russia. Resolutions are usually done by negotiations. The United Nations can definitely provide its good graces to this. I have said that before, that they can do that. And what I think we're called back to is Zelensky's plan for peace. Zelensky's plan for peace maintains the law of nations. It maintains this good international order. He's standing up for these principles that grew up out of the natural law, custom, treaties, and Christianity. He's defending a good order with his peace plan. I think it's a reasonable peace plan. I mean, if I had to make a peace plan, I'd say Russia needs to be disarmed, at least nuclear wise. They need to lose their nuclear armaments because they've threatened people with it. And who knows whether even their nuclear weaponry works. Um, but I think Putin also needs to be, this is Wemhoff's plan, which is much harsher than Zelensky's. I think Russia needs to be disarmed. Its nuclear arsenal needs to be disarmed. I think Putin needs to surrender himself for prosecution because what he's done is very egregious. And I think that's the best security for peace, is to do those things. And we have to look at Russian membership in the UN Security Council. Right after this war started, there were a number of comments made that the UN Security Council needs to be reworked because, and some people were calling for the removal of Russia because what had happened was Russia was vetoing any efforts by the UN Security Council to create the conditions for peace, to create a peacekeeping force. Um, and this was actually a concern that Pope Pius XII had. He said that this veto is going to be problematic down the road, among other things. He had another thing about enforcing judgments of the International Court of Justice, which is a good complaint. It depends. The judgments of the International Court of Justice depend on the good faith, the goodwill, the voluntary compliance of the states. So that's it for today. Those are the issues. What you can see is that the principles for which to determine a peace plan have their roots in Catholic teaching, and President Zelensky is really setting out those principles, that Catholic teaching, in a very practical, measured way in his peace proposal. Thank you. That's all I got.